The first scent of the raid was smoke sharp and wrong on the crisp morning air. It wasn't the familiar gentle curl of hickory from their own chimney, but the acrid stench of burning pine and something else, something greasy and final. Celia Hart paused the laundry basket resting on her hip and looked up at a sky bleached to a pale, unforgiving white. The Arizona winter of 1873 had a way of stealing color from the world, leaving only shades of bone and dust. A single hawk circled in the vast emptiness, a silent, indifferent witness. Inside their small, sturdy cabin, built with love and the sweat of their own brows, Jacob was humming. It was a tuneless, happy sound that always made her smile. He was mending a harness, his broad shoulders hunched over the worn leather and the morning light catching the gold in his brown hair. He was the anchor of her world, the solid ground beneath her feet in a land that was all shifting rock and sand. They had poured their dreams into this small patch of earth. 160 acres of hope wrested from the territory's cruel grasp. "Smell that," Celia asked, stepping inside. The scent of coffee and Jacob's humming filled the warm air. He looked up, his blue eyes crinkling at the corners. "Smells like you're about to ask me to fix the fence again." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "No, it's smoke, not ours." Jacob's smile faded. He rose slowly, his powerful frame filling the small room, and walked to the door. He peered out his hand, shading his eyes against the stark glare. The silence that followed was heavier than any sound. He turned back to her, his face a grim mask. "Riders," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Half a dozen, maybe more. Coming fast." Fear, cold and sharp, pierced Celia's heart. Her hand flew to the small silver ring on her finger, her mother's wedding band, the one Jacob had placed there a year ago. "Who? Doesn't matter who. Get the rifle, Celia." The world narrowed to a series of frantic, disjointed moments. Celia grabbed the Winchester from its pegs over the mantel, her hands moving with a practiced calm she didn't feel. Jacob barred the heavy oak door and moved to the window, his own Colt revolver already in his hand. The humming was gone, replaced by the harsh rasp of his breathing. Outside, the thundering of hooves grew to a deafening roar, a tidal wave of violence about to crash upon their small island of peace. "Stay away from the window," Jacob ordered, his voice tight. A voice boomed from outside, slick with a false, friendly authority. "Jacob Hart, this is Luther Brand's property. You've got 1 minute to vacate before we burn you out. Brand." The name tasted like ash on her tongue. A land baron, a cancer spreading across the territory, devouring homesteads with fraudulent claims and hired guns. They had their deed signed and sealed in Prescott, but a piece of paper was a flimsy shield against men like these. "We have a deed," Jacob yelled back, his voice raw with defiance. The only answer was the splintering crash of the window pane, as a bullet tore through the glass, burying itself in the wall inches from Celia's head. She flinched, a small cry escaping her lips. Jacob fired back a deafening crack that filled the cabin with the smell of gunpowder. The siege had begun. It was a blur of noise and terror. Bullets thudded into the log walls, sending splinters flying like angry wasps. The air grew thick with smoke as the riders circled, firing relentlessly. Celia reloaded the Winchester, her fingers numb, her mind a maelstrom of fear. She could see them through the broken window shadows on horseback, their faces obscured by dust and malice. They were toying with them, enjoying the slow, cruel dismantling of their lives. Then came a different sound, a wet, sickening thump followed by a grunt of pain. Celia turned. Jacob was on one knee, his hand pressed to his side, blood seeping through his fingers. "Jacob," she screamed, dropping the rifle and scrambling to his side. "It's nothing," he gasped, but his face was pale, his breath coming in ragged pants. "Just a scratch. Keep loading." She knew it was a lie. She tore a strip from her apron, pressing it against the wound, but the blood was too much, too fast. His strength was leaving him, draining into the rough-hewn floorboards he had laid with his own hands. He pushed her away gently. The floorboards he rasped, his eyes locking on hers, filled with a desperate urgency. Beneath the hearth. Your father's journal. My strongbox. Take them. You have to go. No, I'm not leaving you. The front door groaned, then splintered under the force of a heavy boot. A large man with a scarred face and cold, dead eyes filled the doorway, a smoking pistol in his hand. Behind him, other figures crowded, their faces triumphant. Jacob pushed himself up, using his last ounce of strength to place his body between Celia and the intruders. He raised his Colt, his arm trembling. "Get out of my house," he snarled. The scarred man laughed, a sound like gravel grinding. "Your house." He fired. The shot was deafening in the small space. Jacob shuddered, a look of shocked surprise on his face, before he crumpled to the floor. The sound that tore from Celia's throat was not human. It was a raw, primal scream of a world breaking apart. She lunged for the Winchester, but a heavy boot slammed down on her wrist, pinning her to the floor. The scarred man loomed over her, his breath smelling of whiskey and rot. He yanked her up by her hair, forcing her to look at Jacob's still form. "Look at him," he sneered. "That's what happens to squatters who don't listen." Grief turned to rage, a white-hot inferno that burned away her fear. She spat in his face. He backhanded her the force of the blow, sending her crashing against the wall. Her head swam, stars exploding behind her eyes. Through the haze, she saw them ransacking the cabin, smashing furniture, their laughter echoing in the ruins of her life. One of them kicked over the lantern. Flames licked up the dry curtains, hungry and swift. The scarred man grabbed her again. "Mr. Brand might want a word with you." In that moment, a desperate clarity cut through her pain. Jacob's words. "You have to go." She drove her elbow hard into the man's stomach. He grunted, his grip loosening for a fraction of a second. It was all she needed. She scrambled away toward the back of the cabin, toward the small window they'd built to catch the morning sun. Smoke filled her lungs, choking her. The heat was unbearable. She had to get to the hearth. She crawled across the floor, the heat scorching her hands, and fumbled with the loose floorboard Jacob had shown her. Her fingers closed around the cool leather of her father's medical journal and the cold steel of the small strongbox. She shoved them into a canvas sack. The back window was her only chance. She smashed the remaining glass with the butt of Jacob's fallen Colt, which she'd scooped up from the floor. As she climbed through the jagged opening, a hand grabbed her ankle. She twisted, brought the heavy pistol down hard on the man's knuckles, and heard a satisfying crack and a howl of pain. She was free. She ran. She ran without looking back, the roar of the fire and the shouts of the men fading behind her. She ran until her lungs burned and her legs gave out, collapsing in a heap behind a rocky outcropping. She clutched the journal and the box to her chest, the only tangible pieces of the life that had been stolen from her. She opened the box. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was their small savings, a few coins, and her mother's silver ring. She'd taken it off to do the laundry. Jacob had teased her about it that morning. The memory was a fresh knife in her heart. She slipped it onto her finger. It was all she had left of him, of them. The cold metal felt like a brand, a promise. She looked back. A pillar of black smoke clawed at the pale sky, a funeral pyre for her husband and her dreams. The world was silent again, save for the bitter wind that tasted of dust and distant snow. In that crushing silence, she made a vow. Luther Brand would pay. She didn't know how, she didn't know when, but she would not let this land turn her into a victim. She would survive. She would endure. And she would hold on to the one thing they couldn't burn, her humanity, now forged in the fires of loss, into something harder, something sharper, something that would cut. Weeks later, the grief was a constant companion, a heavy coat she could not shed. Celia was a ghost haunting the canyons, a fugitive in her own land. Time had blurred into a monotonous cycle of hunger-cold and a gnawing ache in her soul that was worse than either. She and her aging gelding Ashen moved like shadows through a world that seemed determined to erase them. The sun bleached the sky to a pale, unforgiving white by day, and the nights were filled with a cold so deep it seemed to seep into the rock itself, making the very ground feel brittle. Her father's medical journal was her only solace. Its worn leather cover felt like a connection to a kinder past. At night, huddled by a smokeless fire in some hidden arroyo, she would read his elegant script by the faint moonlight. The pages were filled not just with remedies for snakebite and fever, but with his philosophy. "You don't turn from suffering, Celia," he had written. "You face it. A healer's duty is not just to the body, but to the spark of life within." Flashbacks would ambush her in the quiet moments. She saw her father, his hands gentle, as he taught her to identify yarrow and willow bark. She saw Jacob, his face alight with pride, as he hammered the last nail into their cabin roof. These memories were both a comfort and a torture, ghosts of a life so completely annihilated it felt like a dream. The name Luther Brand was the engine of her survival. It was a poison she sipped every morning to fuel her resolve. In a brief, dangerous foray into a dusty way station, she'd listened as two freighters talked. Brand's name was on their lips, spoken with a mixture of fear and grudging respect. He owned the land, the mines, the water. He was a king in this desolate kingdom, and she was just one more peasant crushed under his heel. Her journey had no destination, only a direction away. Away from Brand's reach toward some unclaimed patch of land where she could bury her ghosts. But the territory was vast and indifferent, and her supplies were dwindling to almost nothing. The gnawing hunger was constant. She was on the brink of starvation, her body weary, her spirit beginning to fray. It was in this state of desperation, leading Ashen down a trail that was little more than a scratch in the earth, that she saw it. A glint of crimson stark against the thin layer of snow dusting the ground. Blood. Fresh. Her hand instinctively dropped to the Colt at her hip, its cold steel a familiar weight. Ashen snorted, his ears twitching. Her first instinct, born of weeks of paranoia, was to turn back. This was Apache country. The stories told in whispers around campfires were of swift, merciless raids. To involve herself in another's trouble was to invite her own death. But then she heard it, a faint groan, raw and human, cutting through the wind's mournful wail. Her father's words echoed in her mind, as clear as if he were standing beside her. "You face it, damn you, father," she whispered, her voice hoarse. Holding fast to her humanity felt like a luxury she could no longer afford. And yet to turn away felt like a betrayal of everything Jacob had died for. Cautiously, she tethered Ashen to a skeletal juniper and followed the glistening trail, the Colt now firm in her hand. Behind a cluster of jagged boulders, a man lay sprawled in the long, cold shadows. He was Apache, his long black hair matted with blood and dirt, his buckskin leggings torn. A gunshot wound gaped in his thigh, the flesh around it swollen and angry. A shallower gash bled sluggishly from his chest. His hand clutched a knife, its hilt inlaid with a turquoise eagle that glinted like a defiant eye. He was young, his face a mask of pain, his lips cracked and white. Every nerve screamed at her to run. The cavalry paid bounties for Apache scalps. Brand's men would likely do the same. If she were found with him, she'd be branded a traitor and hanged from the nearest tree. But as she watched, his chest rose and fell, each breath a fragile, heroic effort. In that struggle, she saw Jacob's last moments. She saw the spark of life her father had written about, flickering, fighting not to be extinguished. This man, this enemy of her people, was a human being in agony. Leaving him to die would be to let Luther Brand win, to let the cruelty of this land finally hollow her out and make her as empty as the canyons around her. She holstered the Colt. The decision settled over her, heavy and irrevocable. She knelt beside him, uncorking her nearly empty canteen. His eyes, black and glazed with fever, flickered open. They were filled with pain, but also with a fierce, burning suspicion. He tried to raise the knife, but his arm trembled and fell back useless. "Easy," she whispered, her voice small against the vastness. She soaked her bandana and pressed the cool, damp cloth to his parched lips. He flinched, but did not have the strength to pull away. He drank his throat, working convulsively. "I'm not here to hurt you." The act felt like stepping off a cliff into an unknown abyss. The wound in his leg was septic. The bullet was still in there. He wouldn't survive the night. Not with the cold and the circling predators, both two-legged and four. Looking at the wounded warrior, she knew she was no longer just running from her past. She was now running toward a future she could not possibly predict, armed only with a dead man's wisdom and a promise to another. She had to move him. An old abandoned silver mine, a place her father had once used as a makeshift clinic, was a few miles away. It was a terrible risk, but it was the only one she had. She stood, her resolve hardening like the frozen ground beneath her. "Hold on," she said, as much to herself as to him. The canyon watched, silent and unyielding, as she began the impossible task of saving a life that would almost certainly end her own. The air in the abandoned silver mine was a damp, cold shroud, heavy with the scent of wet earth and forgotten despair. Getting the wounded warrior here had been a brutal ordeal. Celia's muscles screamed in protest, her arms and back burning from the effort of hoisting his dead weight onto Ashen's saddle and leading the horse through the treacherous, ice-slicked terrain. Now, in the flickering light of a small, risky fire, she faced the true test. The man, the Apache, lay on a bed of old burlap sacks, his breathing a shallow, ragged whisper. The fever was raging through him, his skin hot to the touch. The bullet wound in his thigh was a festering horror, the flesh around it a dark, angry purple. Infection was setting in, a poison that would kill him far more certainly than the bullet itself. Celia laid out the contents of her father's medical kit on a flat stone, a thin-bladed knife, a metal probe, a needle, and gut thread, and a small bottle of laudanum, nearly empty. Her hands shook as she looked from the crude instruments to the unconscious man. Her father had taught her to set a bone to stitch a wound. But this was surgery. You don't have a choice. She muttered to herself, her voice a tremor in the mine's oppressive silence. She poured a splash of whiskey, her last, over the knife, and probed the sharp scent of alcohol cutting through the musty air. She cleaned the wound as best she could with boiled cloth, her stomach churning at the sight. Then she took a deep breath, uncorked the laudanum, and gently trickled a few precious drops between his cracked lips. It wasn't enough to render him truly unconscious, but she prayed it would be enough to dull the edge of the agony to come. She made the first cut. The man's body jerked violently, a guttural groan tearing from his throat. His eyes flew open, wild with fever and pain. But they didn't see her. He was trapped in his own delirium. Celia's heart hammered against her ribs, but she forced her hands to be steady. Her father's voice was a calm presence in her mind, guiding her. "Find the bullet, Celia. Follow the path of the wound. Be swift." The probe slid into the raw flesh. She felt it scrape against bone, a sickening, grating sensation that vibrated up her arm. Sweat stung her eyes. The firelight danced, casting long, monstrous shadows on the cavern walls. The man thrashed his good leg, kicking out, and she had to throw her weight across his chest to hold him down, whispering apologies he couldn't hear. Almost there, she grunted, her teeth clenched. "Just hold on." Finally, she felt it, the soft, yielding click of the probe against lead. With painstaking care, she used the tip of the knife to work the mangled slug free. It dropped into a tin cup with a small, definitive clink. The sound was the most beautiful thing she had ever heard. The rest was a blur of exhaustion and focus. She packed the cleaned wound with yarrow leaves to fight the infection and stitched the flesh closed with clumsy, desperate sutures. She bound it tightly with the last of her clean cloth. Finished, she sank back on her heels, every muscle trembling. The man's breathing was still shallow, but it seemed less strained. The first battle was won. A few hours later, as she was dozing by the fire, a patrol of riders passed the mouth of the mine. She heard their voices rough and loud, echoing in the canyon. "Brand wants that Apache found he's the key to that silver lode in the Dragoons. I heard he's Nantan's boy. Big bounty on his head." Celia held her breath, her hand wrapped around the grip of her Colt. The voices faded, but the words hung in the air, cold and heavy. Nantan, the great Chiricahua chief. She was sheltering royalty, a man whose capture could ignite the entire territory. The next morning, the fever broke. The Apache warrior awoke, his eyes clear for the first time. He stared at her, then at his bandaged leg, his expression a mixture of confusion and deep-seated suspicion. He tried to sit up his hand, going for the turquoise-hilted knife at his side. "Easy," Celia said, holding up her hands. "You've been shot. I took the bullet out." He stared at her, his dark eyes searching her face. "Why?" he finally rasped, his voice rough from disuse. His English was precise, formal, clearly learned, but not native. "Because you were dying," she said simply. He did not thank her. He merely watched her, his gaze intense and weighing. For days, a tense silence existed between them. She brought him water and rabbit broth, which he accepted with a stiff, proud reluctance. She learned he was as stubborn as the rock of the canyon walls. One evening, as she was rereading a passage in her father's journal, he spoke again. "My name is Tay." It was an offering, a crack in the wall of his mistrust. "Celia," she replied. "Celia," he repeated, testing the name. He gestured toward the journal. "You read. You are not like the other Pindalikoyi." The white eyes. "My father was a healer," she explained. "He taught me." Tay nodded slowly. "My father is a leader. He teaches me to fight." He looked down at his leg, then back at her. "You have a warrior's hands. But your eyes, they hold a great sadness." The observation was so direct, so unnervingly accurate, that it broke something open inside her. The grief she had held so tightly in her chest came pouring out. She told him everything about Jacob, the homestead, the fire, and the man named Luther Brand. She spoke until her voice was raw, the story tumbling out into the safe, quiet dark of the mine. Tay listened without interruption, his face unreadable in the flickering firelight. When she finished, a long silence fell. "This Luther Brand," Tay said, his voice a low growl. "I know this name. He tears the earth open for the shining rock. He respects nothing. He is the reason for the bullet in my leg. His men ambushed my hunting party." The connection slammed into Celia with the force of a physical blow. Their separate tragedies were not separate at all. They were two threads of the same violent tapestry, woven by the same cruel hand. "He is hunting you," Celia said, the pieces clicking into place. "For a silver mine." Tay's hand closed over the turquoise eagle amulet he wore around his neck. "It is not a mine. It is a sacred place. A place where the spirits of the mountain sleep. Brand's greed would wake them, and their anger would poison the land. My father, Nantan, has sworn to protect it with his blood, and I with mine." In that moment, their relationship shifted. They were no longer a white woman and an Apache warrior, separated by a chasm of history and hate. They were survivors, allies. They were bound by a common enemy. "His men are still out there," Celia said, her voice hard. "We can't stay here." "No," Tay agreed, testing his weight on his injured leg. He winced, but his jaw was set. "We cannot. We must go to my people in the Dragoon Mountains. There we will be safe, and there we will plan how to take back what this Brand has stolen." His gaze met hers across the small fire, and for the first time she saw not suspicion, but respect. A tentative alliance was forged, born of shared pain and a burning desire for justice. The mine was no longer a sanctuary. It was a starting point. And as they prepared to leave its shelter, Celia knew she was no longer just running away from her past. She was marching toward a reckoning. The journey to Redemption Gulch was a calculated risk. Tay needed time to regain his strength, and Celia's supplies had been reduced to dust and memories. The town was a festering sore on the landscape, a dusty collection of false-fronted buildings huddled under the shadow of the mountains. But it was the only place within a week's ride to get flour salt and precious ammunition. She left Tay hidden in a high defensible cave, his knife in hand, and his eyes alert, promising to return by nightfall. Riding into town on ashen Celia felt 100 pairs of eyes on her. She pulled the brim of her worn hat low, trying to look like just another broke prospector's wife. The town was buzzing with talk of Luther Brand. His name was scrawled on the sign of the saloon, the livery, even the general store. He owned it all. Her first stop was the doctor's office. It was a small, cluttered room that smelled of carbolic acid and stale pipe smoke. Dr. Alistair Finch was a world-weary man with kind, tired eyes and hands stained with iodine. He had known her father. "Celia Hart," he said, his eyebrows rising in surprise. I heard about what happened out at your place. Terrible business." He looked around nervously, lowering his voice. "You shouldn't be here. Brand's men are everywhere. I need quinine and bandages," Dr. Celia said, cutting to the point. "I can pay." He studied her face, the new hard lines around her eyes. "It's not payment I'm worried about." He gathered the supplies, his movements slow and deliberate. As he wrapped them, he sighed. "This whole territory is a powder keg, and Luther Brand is holding the match. He's a man hollowed out by grief. Celia fills the empty space with power and land." Grief, the word sounded wrong when applied to a man like Brand. Dr. Finch polished his spectacles with a corner of his vest. Years ago, before he was the king of this county, he had a wife, a young son. Cholera took them both. Happened so fast. Your father was there, you know. He did everything he could, but it was no use. Brand never recovered. Blamed himself, blamed the land, blamed God. I think he even blamed your father in his madness. The doctor's words were a casual bombshell dropped without knowledge of their devastating impact. Celia's blood ran cold. Her father had never spoken of it. She paid for the supplies and left her mind reeling. At the general store, she bought flour and cartridges, her ears open. 2 of Brand's hired guns were at the counter, their laughter loud and coarse. They were talking about the hunt for Nantan's son, bragging about the bounty. Her presence went unnoticed, another drab woman in a dusty town. Her last stop was the sheriff's office. She didn't know why she went. Perhaps it was a last flickering ember of faith in the law. Sheriff Brody was a man overwhelmed by his own impotence, a tin star pinned to a faded shirt. His office was a mountain of paperwork under a leaking roof. "There's nothing I can do, Mrs. Hart," he said, not meeting her eyes. "Brand's got the judge in his pocket. His land claims are all legal on paper, at least. My advice, keep riding and don't look back." His gaze was a mixture of pity and fear. He was a good man in a bad situation, and they both knew it. Celia rode out of Redemption Gulch with a heavy heart and the doctor's words echoing in her mind. Back in the safety of the cave, as Tay ate the hardtack she'd brought, Celia pulled out her father's journal. Her hands trembled as she flipped through the pages, searching for a date from years ago, a mention of a tragedy she never knew existed. And then she found it. The entry was short, the handwriting uncharacteristically shaky. October 1865. Have failed. A mother and her boy taken by the cholera plague near the San Pedro River. The husband, a man named Brand, is consumed by a grief so vast it is like a canyon. He looks at me with the eyes of a man who has lost his soul. I offered what comfort I could, but my medicine was useless. My words were ash. There is no remedy for a loss this profound. I carry this failure with me. The journal slipped from her fingers. It all crashed down on her with breathtaking, horrifying clarity. This wasn't about land. It wasn't about silver. It was a vendetta. A deeply personal, twisted quest for revenge against the ghost of the man Luther Brand believed had failed him. And she, Celia, was the last living piece of that man's legacy. Brand wasn't just trying to take her land. He was trying to erase her, to finish the destruction of the family he blamed for his own ruin. She looked at Tay, who was watching her, his expression concerned. "What is it?" he asked. "I know why he wants me dead," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "And it has nothing to do with my homestead." The realization didn't bring fear. It brought a strange, cold fury. The conflict had been reframed. Her simple quest for justice had become a battle for her father's memory, for the truth of his life, against the twisted narrative of a broken, vengeful man. The stakes were no longer just about survival. They were about legacy. The new knowledge hardened Celia's resolve, but it also planted a seed of dread. Brand's obsession was not rational. It was the all-consuming fire of old grief, and it would not be satisfied with anything less than her complete annihilation. Their flight from Brand's men was no longer a simple evasion. It was an escape from a madman's ghost story, and she was the final chapter he was determined to write. Brand, enraged by the loss of his men and the continued elusiveness of his quarry, had unleashed his most formidable weapon, a ruthless tracker named Silas Kane. Kane was a legend in the territory, a man who could read a story in a broken twig and follow a trail over bare rock. He moved through the wilderness, not as a visitor, but as a part of it, silent and deadly as a mountain lion. Celia and Tay were forced to move faster, their brief respite shattered. Tay's leg was stronger, but the pace was punishing. Kane was relentless, pushing them out of the foothills and into the labyrinthine maze of canyons that scarred the earth like deep wounds. Days blurred into a desperate rhythm of climbing, hiding, and running. The tracker was a ghost at their heels, always just out of sight, his presence a palpable pressure on the back of their necks. They were finally cornered in a narrow box canyon. The sheer rock walls rose on three sides, a perfect trap. The only way out was the way they had come in, and Kane was already there, a silhouette against the setting sun, flanked by two of Brand's thugs. Nowhere left to run, Boy Kane's voice echoed off the rock, cold and devoid of emotion. "The woman, too. Brand wants you both. Alive, if possible. He's got questions for you." Tay drew his knife, his body tensing, ready to sell his life dearly. Celia raised her Colt, but she knew it was hopeless. 3 rifles against 1 pistol and a knife. As Kane's men advanced, their boots crunching on the loose gravel, Celia's eyes scanned their surroundings, her mind racing. Her gaze fell upon a collapsed mine shaft at the base of the canyon wall, its timbers splintered and gray with age. Near the entrance, half buried in scree, were several rotting wooden crates stenciled with a faded warning, "Danger, dynamite." It was old, left behind, from one of Brand's failed ventures, the nitroglycerin weeping through the wood, making it dangerously unstable. An idea born of pure desperation and a fragment of her father's knowledge sparked in her mind. Her father had treated enough miners to know the properties of dynamite. He'd once told her how the old unstable sticks could be detonated by a sharp impact alone. "The dynamite," she whispered to Tay, her voice tight. "If I can hit one of those crates." Tay followed her gaze. A flicker of understanding and then grim acceptance crossed his face. "It is a long shot. It's the only one we have," she replied. They needed a diversion. Tay gave a sharp, piercing cry, a Chiricahua war cry that echoed through the canyon like the scream of a hawk. He hurled his knife, a silver blur in the fading light. It wasn't aimed to kill, but to distract. The blade thudded into the wooden stock of a rifle, making the man cry out in surprise. It was the opening Celia needed. She dropped to one knee, bracing the colt with both hands, just as her father had taught her. The world narrowed to the front sight of the pistol. The crate was 60 yards away, a small dark target in the deepening shadows. Cain and his men were recovering, raising their rifles. She didn't have time to aim for a fuse she couldn't see. She had to hit the crate itself. Mechel, squeeze, don't pull. She fired. The bullet whined through the air. For a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. One of Cain's men laughed. Then a corner of the crate splintered. The unstable dynamite inside detonated with a deafening, earth-shattering roar. Fire and rock erupted from the side of the canyon. The ground bucked beneath them, and the air was filled with a concussive force that threw them both to the ground. The blast triggered a rock slide, a river of stone and dust that poured down from the canyon wall directly into the path of Silas Cain and his men. Their screams were cut short as they were swallowed by the avalanche. Silence descended thick and absolute, broken only by the trickle of falling pebbles. A cloud of acrid dust filled the canyon, choking them. Celia pushed herself up her ears, wringing her body bruised. Tay was beside her, doing the same. They were alive. The rock slide had not only eliminated their pursuers, but it had also opened a new path, a jagged, treacherous scramble up the canyon wall where the mine shaft had been. It was their escape. They climbed, their hands raw, their lungs burning, until they reached the rim of the canyon. Below them lay a scene of utter devastation. There was no sign of Cain or his men. They were buried, entombed in the very rock they sought to conquer. Tay looked at Celia, his face awed in the twilight. "My father speaks of the mountain spirits," he said, his voice hushed. "Today I believe they answered your call." Celia shook her head, the colt still heavy in her hand. "That wasn't a spirit," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "That was desperation. They had escaped, but the act had sealed their fate. They were no longer just fugitives. They were warriors who had struck a decisive blow against Luther Brand. He would not send trackers anymore. Now he would come himself. With Tay as her guide, Celia finally reached the Chiricahua stronghold in the Dragoon Mountains. The rancheria was a hidden sanctuary, a valley nestled so deep within the granite peaks that it seemed a world apart. She was met with suspicion, the gazes of the warriors as sharp and hard as their obsidian arrowheads. A white woman was an omen, a harbinger of violence. But Tay, now standing among his own people, was no longer a fugitive, but a chief's son. He spoke with authority, his voice ringing through the valley as he recounted their story. He told of her skill as a healer, her courage in the mine, and the fire she had called down in the canyon. He held up his turquoise amulet, a symbol of his word. When he finished, he turned to Celia and declared, "She is my friend. She has the heart of a Chiricahua." The suspicion in the people's eyes softened into a cautious respect. She was brought before the great chief himself, Nantan. He was a man whose dignity was carved into the deep lines of his face, his eyes holding the wisdom of 1,000 winters. He listened to his son's story, his gaze never leaving Celia. When Tay was finished, Nantan rose and placed a hand on Celia's shoulder. "The enemy of my enemy is welcome at my fire," he said, his English slow and deliberate. Celia had earned a fragile trust, but she could not stay. Her fight was not in these mountains. "I have to go back," she told Tay one evening as they sat by the central fire. "To my homestead. It's the only place this can end." Tay understood. This was her battle to reclaim not just her land, but her life. "You will not go alone," he said. He, along with 3 of Nantan's most trusted warriors, would ride with her, not to fight her war, but to see that the fight was an honorable one. They rode east, back toward the land that had been stolen from her. The homestead stood as she had left it, a dark silhouette against the bruised purple of a stormy sky. But it was no longer empty. Lantern light glowed from the rebuilt windows. Smoke curled from the chimney. Luther Brand was inside waiting. He had made her home his fortress. A violent thunderstorm was rolling in the air, thick with the smell of ozone. Thunder rumbled in the distance, a low growl that mirrored the fury in Celia's heart. Tay and the warriors crept toward the house under the cover of the growing darkness. "This is my fight," Celia told them, her hand on the butt of her Colt. "Stay out of sight unless I call." Tay nodded. "We will be your shadow." She walked to the front door, the new door that had replaced the one Brand's men had splintered, and pushed it open. Luther Brand was sitting in a high-backed chair before the fireplace, a glass of brandy in his hand. He was not the brutish thug she had imagined. He was tall, impeccably dressed, with silvering hair at his temples, and a face that might have been handsome before grief had chiseled it into a cold, predatory mask. The room was just as she remembered it, but wrong. Her mother's rocking chair was gone, replaced by a gun rack. A grandfather clock in the corner ticked down the seconds, each one a hammer blow against the tense silence. "Celia Hart Brand," said his voice, calm, cultured, and utterly chilling. He didn't seem surprised to see her. "I was wondering when you'd come home." "This isn't your home, Brand," she said, her voice shaking only slightly. She raised the Colt, its barrel steady. He smiled, a thin, mirthless stretching of his lips. "Oh, but it is. It's the place where my story ends. And yours." He took a slow sip of brandy. "You have your father's eyes." He had that same look of misplaced certainty, the look of a man who thinks he can fix a world that is fundamentally broken. The first crack of thunder shook the house, and the rain began to fall, lashing against the windows. "You're doing this because of what happened to your family." Celia said the words, tasting like poison. "Because you blame my father?" Brand's smile vanished, replaced by a flash of raw pain. "Blame him?" he hissed, rising from his chair. "He was an incompetent fool who stood by and watched my wife and son die. He offered me prayers when I needed medicine. He called it God's will. It was his failure. He was a healer, not a god," Celia shot back. "He mourned them. He wrote about it. He wrote about his failure, his grief for your family." Brand laughed, a harsh, broken sound. "His grief. Let me tell you about his grief." He walked to a heavy wooden desk and pulled out a small ledger. He threw it onto the table between them. He was so overcome with grief that for 5 years he sent me money. Anonymous payments every month. A guilty man's penance. He knew he was to blame. He was trying to buy my silence. But my soul was never for sale. The revelation struck Celia with the force of a physical blow. Her father sending money. It wasn't an admission of guilt. It was an act of profound secret compassion from a man who felt he had failed. But Brand, in his canyon of grief, had twisted it into something ugly, something that fed his righteous, all-consuming rage. She finally understood. He didn't want justice. He wanted to destroy the memory of the man whose goodness was a constant searing reminder of his own loss. "You're wrong," she whispered, her heart breaking for her father's hidden pain, for this man's poisoned soul. "Am I, Brand?" Snarled, his composure finally cracking. He lunged across the table, not for her, but for the gun rack. He was faster than she expected. Celia fired. The shot went wide as Brand slammed the table into her, sending her stumbling back. He pulled a shotgun from the rack. The grandfather clock chimed the hour. Outside lightning split the sky, illuminating the room in a stark, violent flash. In that instant, she saw Tay and the warriors appear like phantoms in the doorways and broken windows. Brand saw them too. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, his eyes wide with disbelief. It was the only opening she needed. She threw herself to the side as he fired the shotgun, the blast tearing a hole in the wall where she had been standing. She landed hard, the Colt flying from her hand. Brand turned the shotgun on her, a look of grim triumph on his face. This was it, the end of his story. Suddenly, a turquoise-hilted knife flew through the air, embedding itself deep in Brand's shoulder. He roared in pain, dropping the shotgun. He staggered back, clutching the hilt, his eyes locking on Tay in the doorway. Celia scrambled for her pistol. She got to her feet, the Colt steady in her hand, aimed directly at Luther Brand's heart. He stood there, wounded, defeated, the rain and thunder, his only audience. The hate was gone from his eyes, replaced by a vast, hollow emptiness. He had lost everything, all over again. He looked at the pistol, then at her. "Do it," he rasped. "Finish it." Celia looked at the man before her, a hollow shell filled with nothing but pain. Killing him would be an execution, not a victory. It would make her into the monster he was. She remembered Jacob's last words, her father's journal, the promise she'd made to herself in the smoke and ruins of her life. She lowered the gun. "No," she said, her voice clear and strong above the storm. "You're going to live with what you've done." At that moment, the door burst open again. Sheriff Brody stood there, flanked by 2 armed men. A U.S. Marshal's star was pinned to his chest. He had finally found his courage. His eyes took in the scene, the wounded land baron, the armed Apache warriors, and the woman holding a pistol, her face a mask of iron resolve. The storm outside began to subside, its fury spent. In the quiet aftermath, the world set itself right. The U.S. Marshal, a man of quiet integrity, listened to Celia's story, to the sheriff's testimony, and reviewed the fraudulent deeds Brand had used to build his empire. With Brand captured, and his network of corruption exposed, his reign of terror was over. The legal title to Celia's homestead was declared ironclad and absolute. Tay and his warriors stayed for 2 days silent guardians until the last of Brand's influence had been swept from the valley. On the morning of their departure, Celia stood with Tay by the newly mended corral fence. The air was clean washed by the storm. "You have your home back," Tay said, his gaze sweeping over the land. "We have it back," Celia corrected him gently. He nodded, a rare small smile touching his lips. "You have shown my people that a bridge can be built with courage, not just with blood. If you ever need us, the mountains will hear you." He placed his hand over his heart for a moment, a gesture of profound respect before mounting his horse. Celia watched them ride away until they were just small specks against the vast blue sky. Their bond was unbreakable, forged in fire and loyalty, a testament to a connection that defied the hatred of their worlds. She was alone, but for the first time in a long time, she was not lonely. Months passed. Spring arrived, breathing new life into the scarred land. The Arizona winter gave way to a riot of color as wildflowers bloomed across the valley. Celia worked from sunup to sundown, rebuilding not just her home, but her life. The cabin was whole again, the scent of fresh-cut pine chasing away the ghosts of fire and smoke. One morning, she was surprised to see Nantan and a dozen of his people arrive, not with weapons, but with sacks of seed corn and tools. They did not speak of the past. Instead, they worked alongside her, helping her plow and plant the first crop in the rich, dark earth. It was a silent, powerful acknowledgement of the new peace, a promise of a shared future. That evening, after they had gone, Celia stood before her new stone hearth. She took her mother's silver wedding ring from her finger and placed it on the rough-hewn mantelpiece. Next to it, she set a small bird carefully carved from a piece of scrap wood, a simple likeness she had made of Jacob, who had always loved the morning larks. The 2 objects sat side by side, a symbol of a past honored, a love that endured, and a future she was building with her own 2 hands. She had found her peace. A week later, a lone rider approached, not with threats, but with a letter. It was from a lawyer in St. Louis. A great-aunt she had never met had passed away, leaving Celia a modest inheritance. It was not a fortune, but it was more than enough to buy a few head of cattle, proper tools, and everything she needed to ensure her homestead would not just survive, but thrive. It felt like a final gentle nod from fate, a quiet affirmation that her struggle had not been in vain. She stood on her porch, the letter in her hand, and looked out at the rows of sprouting corn. The land was no longer cruel or indifferent. It was hers. She had faced its hardships, honored its ghosts, and earned her place upon it. The wind whispered through the new leaves on the cottonwood tree, and for the first time it sounded like a song of hope.